Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum. On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, our old friend Dustin Dopirak is back. He's back on the IU beat, now covering Indiana, Butler, and Purdue for The Athletic, and he's back on Podcast on the Brink to join us in talking about, what's wrong with Indiana right now. 3 straight losses. The game against Nebraska was obviously just unconscionably bad. What's wrong? What needs to change, both kind of in the bigger picture sense and heading into Saturday's game against Purdue, because the Boilermakers have been playing better. This is obviously a huge game for Indiana coming off that loss to Nebraska. You never want to lose 4 games in a row, and it's your rival, so a lot at stake for Indiana. What do they need to do to get the ship righted in what will be a very tough environment? So we talked to Dustin about that and much, much more on this edition of Podcast on the Brink. Before we get to that conversation, a quick word about our sponsor this week, which is Home Field. And at homefieldapparel.com, who we've been talking about all season long, you'll find the comfiest and most unique licensed IU apparel that is available anywhere. Home Field was started by an IU grad, and all Home Field apparel is designed and printed out of Indianapolis. And with the Big Ten season upon us, we are deeply in the thick of it now. You should check out Home Field's IU Basketball Champions tee, which features IU's 5 championship years, a feat that no other Big Ten school has accomplished. I will continue to stump for the Bison logo sweatshirt, the tri-blend material, which is just so fabulously comfortable. So, consider those 2 items. Consider everything that they have there, because they have some really cool, unique items. And when you're there, don't forget to use the promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, at checkout. You will get 15% off your first order. Again, that's promo code BRINK at homefieldapparel.com. Home Field, wear one for the team. And by the way, before we get to this conversation, Dustin was on his phone. There's like 4 spots where it kind of cuts out a little bit, but it comes right back. So when you hear that, you can make out what he's saying, so I didn't edit any of it out, just so that, it would all be one take and there wouldn't be any choppy edits. So just, kind of fight through that. It'll be fine. Just know that when it happens, it doesn't happen for long, and you'll get right back to the conversation on the other side of it. All right, so here we go. Here is our conversation with Dustin Dopirak. All right, well, we are excited to be joined on Podcast on the Brink this week by Dustin Dopirak, who covers IU, Butler, and Purdue for The Athletic. Dustin, it's great to have you back on the beat. Welcome to Podcast on the Brink.
Thank you, man. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So let's just start out with a real easy question for you to kind of ease into things here. What's wrong with Indiana?
a lot, apparently. I think I do still look at Monday night as an anomaly. I don't think that's something you're going to see. Archie Miller obviously had to take that one on the chin and say, hey, this is my fault. I'm obviously not pressing some buttons right. But he did point out, obviously, that effort has not been an issue with this team, and it was an issue on Monday night. They looked asleep. They looked like they never really got started or got going, and that's not typical. That's not necessarily an issue that you look at and say, well, this team's not motivated. It has problems, caring about the game or whatever. That wasn't typical. So I don't think you're going to see that again. If you do see it again on Saturday, then you've got a real problem. Then you have to ask some bigger questions about whether this, team has already been lost, which is hard to even fathom at this point. All signs to me tell me that the effort level Monday was an anomaly. But there are still some real structural issues with this team. And obviously at this point, it's far too dependent on Romeo Langford and Juwan Morgan. They're just not getting a lot from anybody else. They're getting virtually zero from their bench right now. I think, Rob Finney is still getting it together, and you're going to see him get back to being where he was within a game or two. Evan Pfitzner is pretty much useless right now. Devontae Green obviously has been as erratic as you'd expect. Justin Smith on one side of the floor has been tremendous, playing, defense and rebounding. Offense He's just sort of scared with the ball in his hand. And Al Durham, some days you get something, some days you don't, obviously. And he only played 6 minutes on Monday night because of whatever injury it is that he has. So there's just not enough coming from guys who are not named Romeo Langford and Juwan Morgan right now. And I think that will get a little bit better, but I'm not sure how much.
Dustin, I'm going to ask you a big picture question here, but I think you're a good person to chime in on this because of your perspective covering this program, kind of when it was at the top of where it got to with Crean. There's been a lot of people after this loss, for whatever reason, kind of losing their minds that something's fundamentally wrong. I'm kind of curious from your perspective, has this season gone about as you expected it to go? And do you see anything from the last 3 games that would make you wonder kind of where this season is heading as a whole?
I mean, this season, but not the program. I mean, I think that's the thing that sort of surprised me is that when the narrative has gotten into, well, is this the wrong guy? And it's just like, okay, everybody back up the train a little bit here. I mean, it's obviously, comparing it to Crean's era is very different because he did start out from the bottom. And, there's obviously the one good piece of that when you're starting from the bottom is one, you get a lot of time. And when it comes together, it all comes together at once. I think what's been interesting, what's different from Archie's standpoint is it's sort of building it piece by piece in a different kind of way. It's not necessarily, you're not bringing in recruits necessarily in waves in the same way. It's not like the guys are all coming up together like Indiana's guys did with the Watford Halls class and with Zeller and those guys. It's just a different form of, and I don't even know if the word is rebuild. It's just, I don't know. You just can't judge it on the same plane. But I mean, I haven't looked at anything that says like, okay, all right, if Archie's doing this and this is a flawed method of how you build a program or how you build a team. But I mean, the team as it is right now, I mean, that it's raised some questions to me again, just the fact that there's just not a lot of, especially offensive contribution coming out from outside of Morgan and Langford. And again, you've seen it from Finney, and I think you will see it again. But, there hasn't been a third scorer. There hasn't been a guy they can rely upon. And I do think that's an issue going forward in a Big Ten that is really sturdy top to bottom and has at least two great teams in it. The way they're playing, it's, the way they're structured, it's going to be hard for them to win a lot of games. But I don't necessarily see it as, okay, this guy's handling building Indiana the wrong way. And even beyond just what he's got right now, he's got Chase Jackson Davis in the fold and Armand Franklin in the fold. As far as getting players and building a program, I don't think there's anything that suggests that, man, Miller's not the right guy and you have to start thinking about it in those terms. But this team's ceiling is lower than I thought it was a week ago. That I would say.
Yeah, the last week really has seemed to change part of the narrative. I mean, I think up to the Nebraska game, the season kind of felt like how most reasonable people thought it would go. They got some nice wins in the non-conference, lost a couple of games. The Michigan and Maryland losses were tough, each in their own way, but not, unconscionable in any way. I mean, those losses were explainable. Then you lose by 15 at home to Nebraska playing totally listless, and it just seemed to totally change the narrative, or at least exacerbate maybe some little grumblings that were beneath the surface. So now Indiana's facing this trip to Mackey Arena. And, this is two teams right now that are going in opposite directions. Indiana's struggling. Purdue has really rebounded well since the loss to Notre Dame. You talked about some of the struggles Indiana has, especially offensively. Knowing what you know about Purdue and how they, the challenges they present, the personnel they have, what do you think are some things Indiana can do, maybe offensively, to get some other guys going so that we don't see a repeat of what we saw against Nebraska, where they just pack it in, clog up the lane, force Romeo and Juwan to beat them without giving Romeo and Juwan any room to work?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, I don't think you haven't seen. You rarely, if ever, see any zone from Purdue. I certainly haven't seen any this year, and I think that's actually probably the best way to beat Indiana. I think really Nebraska, I wouldn't say stumbled upon something, but that 1-3-1 kind of exactly it causes sort of the exact kind of problems, sort of worst kind of problems for Indiana, because they don't shoot it well enough to blow you out of it. It makes it a little bit. You can get Morgan the ball in a 2-3. I think he did it, really well against Jacksonville when they ran it. Certainly, that's Jacksonville running as opposed to some other teams. But that 1-3-1 again, really took away the elbows, made it hard for Langford to get the ball in a place where he could really get ahead of steam going anywhere. And, it wasn't as easy to get Morgan in a place where he could really sort of isolate on somebody. And, no one else was getting open shots or finding a way to probe that defense at all. So you're not going to see Purdue do that. That's one thing. Obviously, it's going to be man. And I think Morgan is an interesting matchup now. With certainly Purdue is different. Why they're getting momentum is because Trevion Williams. He's really just really changed the dynamic for that team very quickly. You can still beat him when he's on defense. I don't think he's a bad defender necessarily, but he's young. You saw Ethan Happ really make him look foolish, and I think Juwan Morgan can do the same. Basically, he's still a guy that's figuring out what kind of moves his opponents are capable of. I mean, he's got to do a lot of film study, and it's new to him, basically, just dealing with guys that can make plays at that level. And I think if they can get the ball to Morgan, he's going to be able to get his points. And I think Langford, I'll be very interested to see as to how Purdue handles Langford, because I think really the best guy to put on him is probably Nogel Eastern. And, he's a point guard and usually defense point guards, usually defense primary ball handlers. You don't see him running around a lot, but he's their best option as a perimeter defender. So I'll be interested to see if they go with him or not, or if they just stick him on Finney and hope that he just swallows him up. But I think, Langford can still win that matchup. I think Langford can still find a way of getting, some points inside. There are other guys maybe that can take advantage of some easier matchups. I think Carson Edwards, as good an offensive player as he is, has defensive lapses. He's capable of being a good defensive player. He doesn't always care on that end. So whoever's dealing with him, I think, has a shot to get something going, especially if it's fantasy. He might have a possibility of getting some points that way. I think Justin Smith is going to be more athletic than whoever they put on him. I imagine he'll deal with a Grady Eifert, or Aaron Wheeler's a pretty good athlete, but I don't know. He can take advantage and get some buckets the way Justin Smith gets some buckets. I mean, obviously, we've seen he is not a very advanced offensive player in terms of skill set, but he has some raw athleticism, and that might be enough to get him some points that way. But that's about it. Again, it's going to be man to man. It's going to be simple. It's just going to be a question of beating your guy. And Purdue has a couple good defensive players. They're a generally good defensive team. But there are some places I think where Indiana can get some points.
Dustin, I want to go back to the Nebraska game. As painful as it might be to folks listening to this podcast, as it may be, I want to go back to that just for a second and ask you, as someone who's, I think, watched every game this season for the most part, or at least gone back and probably watched film if you weren't at the game that night. Besides the zone, what did you see the other night that Indiana just simply didn't do well enough? Was it really just the lack of energy? Was it the slow start? Was it, I guess, kind of take us through in your mind what you saw from that performance and maybe why it was a bit alarming.
Yeah, no, all of the above, but I mean, the energy is really the part that stands out to you, because again, that's something that hasn't been a problem, hasn't been an issue. But I mean, there were only a few spurts where you really saw them getting after it, and that is again what's the biggest alarming piece, is they just didn't seem to have a lot of fight to them, and they've always at least had some fight to them, and they've been able to get after people defensively. They got beat on some easy stuff, it seemed like, defensively. They got beat on some dribble drives, left some shooters open, really sort of basic stuff in terms of defending somebody. And Nebraska was really able to exploit that. I mean, they had some stretches where they defended really well. They managed to shut Nebraska down for a while. I can't remember what their longest drought was, but it might have been sort of 6 minutes towards the end of the half, if I'm not mistaken. But get themselves in a position where they were within a bucket, down 3 points. And I think Nebraska had like 4 threes in a row or something like that, or at least it was 3. And those were wide open looks. Those were easy. For them to make those shots. There were some bad turnovers in there. Just sort of basic defensive stuff, and just nobody got going offensively. Other than, I mean, Langford certainly had his moments. Morgan had a couple, even though he had maybe a few more struggles maybe than you usually see from him. But really, nobody else did anything. I think I'm amazed at how bad Evan Pfitzner is right now. In terms of a guy that. Even if he just does what he's brought in to do, even if he just hits threes, there's some value there. And he's not even hitting short jumpers, let alone threes. There's just nothing to his offensive game right now. You're not getting anything out of him. You take Durham out of the game. You put yourself in a position where Devontae Green has to take a lot more shots. He misses a bunch, and they didn't necessarily move the ball well. They didn't really take good shots. There wasn't anything that I saw that was good. Except for a handful of stretches when they fought and got back in it, and Langford making some Langford plays. There just wasn't a lot to point to that said, man, this is a good thing. I mean, 2 for 14 from three is rough. This isn't a good, 3-point shooting team, but that's, you got to get something from the rest of those guys. I mean, and that's one thing that some of those guys can do, especially Green. They should be able to at least hit you a couple shots. You're just not getting anything from those guys right now.
I'm going to hop in here real quick so we can talk about our other sponsor for this week, SeatGeek. As you know, getting tickets online can be far too complicated with hundreds of sites and varying levels of reliability. It's hard to know who to trust, and that's why SeatGeek is the way to go. SeatGeek pulls millions of tickets into one place so that you can easily find the seats you want for a price you're willing to pay. There's nothing quite like being there in person, and SeatGeek will get you closer to the action for a great value. Perhaps you want to go to West Lafayette this weekend and cheer on the Hoosiers. I'm looking on SeatGeek right now. There are tickets starting at, it looks like, $94 for that game. Some really good seats available as you look here, and that's kind of one of the things that makes SeatGeek nice is when you look, they've got this color-coded system so you can immediately see which seats give you the best value for your dollar. So go to SeatGeek, search for Indiana basketball. You'll find the listing with Purdue, and then you'll see games for the rest of the season too. So if you want to go to a road arena, if you want to watch games at Simon Scott Assembly Hall, surely the performance will be better than the game against Nebraska because no one wants to pay to see that. But if we assume that, I think there should still be plenty of good, fun Indiana games to watch. Enjoy Juwan Morgan, enjoy Romeo Langford, and when you do that in person, definitely make sure that SeatGeek is the place that you go. And another reason is that every purchase is fully guaranteed, and that means that you can shop for tickets on SeatGeek with confidence. That's why I have the app on my phone. That's why I use it when I want concert tickets or sporting event tickets or really any type of live event. SeatGeek is the first place I go. And the best thing is, because you're a listener to Podcast on the Brink, you get $10 off your first purchase. So download the SeatGeek app, enter the promo code BRINK today. That's promo code BRINK. And you will get $10 off your first SeatGeek purchase. SeatGeek, life's an event. We have the tickets. And now back to our conversation with Dustin Dopirak.
So my next question is, are there answers on the bench in any form, do you feel like? That's a question I get the most. Should Demezy Anderson play? Should Clifton Moore play? My personal opinion is if those guys were ready to play, they would have already played by now. Archie Miller, it's always in hindsight 2020. It's easy to say, well, he should have done this, he should have done that. But given that the staff is working with these guys every day in practice, I feel like they would have the best grasp of kind of what's available. At this point, is it just making the best of what you have, or do you think there's maybe an opportunity to get some of those guys in the mix to kind of change up the energy?
I mean, it's interesting. You pointed out there that basically these guys see them in practice. They're obviously making a decision based on what they're seeing there. And obviously they're not going to come out and tell us, well, this guy's trash in practice. This guy's not practicing hard. This guy's not getting after it. Archie's sort of standard line with that is like, yeah, well, we'll look for opportunities to get him in. I mean, it suggests to me that there's something that's not going right there. But from what I've seen in terms of the spurts that we see these guys in, I mean, I think Demezy Anderson's good enough to play based on what I've seen. Again, there might be something he's missing. There might be something that stands out that Archie Miller sees that I don't, just because he's obviously, he's a Division I basketball coach in a major conference at Indiana. He knows what he's seeing. There might be something he's missing on defense, whatever, but I mean, he can score the basketball. He can shoot it. He's got some height. He's got some length. It does seem like he's somebody that could, change the dynamic a little bit. If you put him in and you give him some minutes, let him see if he can get a rhythm. Let him see if he can make some shots. Because I have no idea what I'm missing. It could be anything in terms of what he's not doing well. It might be, fundamental basic stuff that might stand out if you give him more minutes. Maybe he turns the ball over too much or something like that, or makes boneheaded drives. I mean, who knows? There might be something there that we don't see. But in the limited minutes he's got, he's shown potential to me at the very least. I mean, I feel like he is a guy that can score the basketball, can at the very least shoot it, and seems like there's some athleticism there. I think Clifton Moore has earned more minutes. I mean, I don't think there's any question. I'm presuming Pfitzner gets more minutes than Moore does because he can play the four, and Moore doesn't necessarily do that right now. So you're really only getting Moore in the game when you're taking Morgan out. So that's, I think, the best answer as to why he's not playing more. But I think it's clear that Moore's been more effective than Pfitzner in his minutes, at least over the last month. Pfitzner, I think, has hit 1-3 since December 1st, if I'm not mistaken. So I definitely think there are minutes to, Clifton Moore deserves to play more than Evan Pfitzner. I'll put it that way. I'm guessing that the positional thing is part of that issue that they see, that they don't see Moore having the potential to guard a 4, where Pfitzner maybe is more, technically physically capable, but he's not defending well and he's not rebounding well. So I do think he can play more. Jake Forrester has shown a little bit. I don't know if he might just be really far behind. Obviously, we haven't seen him in meaningful minutes at all. Anderson, at least the minutes he got when Zach McRoberts was out, were meaningful. We're against, starters and stuff like that. You haven't really seen Jake Forrester in any kind of, it's almost all been garbage time, almost entirely. So I don't really know where he's at, but I do think there's been some promise there. I think there's at least some opportunity to get him a little bit more time. But I would, easier for me to believe that he's far behind than it is for me to believe that the other two are. And I do think there are minutes for those two guys.
I generally agree, Alex, with what you said about, the coaches see these guys, they probably have the best grasp on it. And that part obviously is true. It becomes difficult in a season like this where there have been so many injuries and, what you thought before the season, certainly what the coaches expected that they were going to have from a lineup standpoint, with everything that's gone wrong and even from just time to practice to get better at things, they haven't really had. And so I have to think from Archie's perspective, he's got to be frustrated that kind of the ideal version of this team in his mind just isn't coalescing. I think this was a team kind of built to be great on defense, and then you get enough offense from your two guys and you can win games. And for some games, Dustin, that has worked. But right now it's not, because Indiana's offense is struggling, but the defense isn't good enough to compensate for it. And so I wonder at some point, it feels like a guy like Demezi probably isn't playing because he struggles on defense. And we've talked a ton on this show on the assembly call when Clifton gets in there, mistakes he makes guarding ball screens and doing this, that, or the other. And so you have a guy like Zach McRoberts out there because he is supposed to be a solid defender. And yet, because of his injuries, he's really struggling defensively. So at some point, do you think Archie, just because of the circumstances of this season, might have to say, okay, we want to build a defensive program, but we might have to sacrifice a little defense and put Demezi out there to space the floor, or put Clifton out there because he can at least get offensive rebounds and get putbacks and give us a spark. Like, I'm not saying we're there. Again, there's so much that we don't know. I just wonder, in a season that has gone in ways that he couldn't have anticipated, right, if maybe a coach who we know is obviously stubborn with his principles, if his challenge now is going to be, can he be flexible enough to adjust in ways that this particular roster with this particular circumstances demands? If that question makes sense.
Yeah, I guess my thing is, at least in situations where it I don't want to say just it makes sense, but like if for instance, like when they were when Langford and Morgan pick up their second foul against Michigan, you got to take those guys out. If you have Zach McRoberts in there instead of Demezi Anderson, where are points coming from? Where? Demezi at least gives you some hope. Basically, some chance that maybe bucket. There are more chances for him to do something for you. McRoberts not scoring for you at all, and he's not defending well enough. So even if he's not a really good defender, okay, how much of a downgrade is he for McRoberts in terms of what McRoberts is right now? Not what he's capable of being when he's healthy, but what he is right now. Yeah, I'm sure he is, but don't you want some kind of scoring? And the same thing with Moore. Don't you want something? As opposed to the nothing that you're getting offensively out of Evan Pfitzner in that case. Again, I don't know if it necessarily means to those guys get more minutes than the veterans, but at least in cases where you don't have any other option to score the basketball, it makes sense to take a chance on those guys, because there is some potential to give you something where, again, there's almost no chance right now you're getting anything offensively out of Pfitzner or McRoberts. That McRoberts isn't even shooting it and Pfitzner's not making it. So, like, when you're in a position where it can really go sideways on you, sometimes I think it makes sense to give those guys an opportunity. And they obviously, in that game, ended up having to just throw Langford and Morgan out there and hope. for most of that half, that they didn't pick up any, a third foul, either one of them. And fortunately for Indiana, they didn't. But I mean, they had to go to those guys really fast because you could tell, like, I'm not getting anything out of this group I'm putting out there on the floor. It just does seem in certain circumstances, again, when you're not getting any offense from anybody else, or, when you have to take Langford off the floor, give one of those guys an opportunity. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be all the time. Maybe again, when you have Langford and Morgan on the floor and you're subbing other guys, it makes sense to put in a Pfitzner, for a Justin Smith, basically, if he's got foul trouble, if he's winded or something like that, or to put in McRoberts for a Devontae Green. But again, when it puts you in a situation where you have no scoring on the floor, that I think is a situation where maybe he has to look at it a little bit differently.
Romeo Langford has been awesome. I mean, for a freshman, not even for a freshman, he's just been awesome for the most part. And, more and more of the offense is now going toward him. I think all IU fans applaud this. I think there haven't been, hasn't been a lot when we've had confidence offensively recently, but when Romeo has the ball in his hands, I think IU fans are feeling pretty good. What do you think, as we kind of move forward here, what will help Indiana kind of get the most out of Romeo moving forward?
I think, and in terms of what they have to do, obviously, I think it's a good move that they've been gradually putting the ball in his hand more, making him a primary ball handler more, making him, setting more ball screens for him, and just putting himself in a position where he's having more point guardish things, basically added to his repertoire. I mean, that makes a huge difference. Anything that can get the ball in his hand helps. I mean, again, I don't know that he has to be the guy running the show. And I think Rob Phinisee has certainly done really well, certainly before the injury. And I think you have to get him back going. I think it's really important that, that you get Rob Phinisee feeling confident again. You have him engaged. You have him involved in the offense. You have him put in positions where he can be aggressive, attack off the dribble, shoot some threes, set some ball screens for him as well. But, you want to do that for Romeo Langford as well. You want to do everything in your power offensively to put the ball in his hand and put him in advantageous situations. And I think they've done pretty well at that. They can still do better and keep doing better. Now, obviously, he's starting to shoot it. The three is starting to come. It's not there. He's not necessarily – he's far from being one of the best shooters in the Big Ten. But if it's consistent, if he's getting a couple a game, it just makes him so much harder to defend. If you have to go out there and he's going to get some threes and he hits the open ones – everything like that, it makes a huge difference. That's obviously what NBA teams want to see from him. It's at this point, considering how well he's played, and anybody that had any hope that maybe he was just not going to play well enough, Romeo's a top 10 pick for absolute 100% certainty. He's gone. So to help himself move up that chain, he has to show he can shoot it, and that obviously helps Indiana a lot. But that's coming. The free throws are coming. That's gotten a lot better. Obviously, you had a lot of issues with that early on. He's gotten much, much better there. So when he is drawing contact, even when he's not finishing, he's still getting points at the line. All that stuff's getting better. So everything that they can do, they're heading in the right direction. It's just got to, I guess, continue going in that direction of, making him a primary ball handler, putting him in more situations where he's getting ball screens, putting him in more opportunities where he gets to go downhill. Basically drive it from straight up top. He's really good. He's really good from driving it anywhere, whether it's from the corner, whether it's from the wing, whether it's from the top of the key. He's just really good at getting the ball in the paint, really good finishing there. Just any more opportunities they have to give him chances to get going downhill is better for Indiana.
Dustin, before Jerod gets us out of here, I'm sure with a question about Saturday specifically, I want to dig into you a little bit because 2014 you left us. Right. I think it was right before the Montreal trip. Did you ever think that you would be back in the Midwest covering college basketball? And when you left, I don't think the Athletic was even a thing. Just what's your experience been like being back, and how much are you enjoying it so far?
It's been really cool. I mean, obviously, especially when I went home to Pittsburgh, I didn't think that I would, end up back here. But obviously, that thing went sideways. And once. Especially when I was out of the business, I definitely looked back and said, man, I really missed this place. And I really missed this job. I really missed this beat. I missed the basketball beat even when I was covering Tennessee football. I mean, even when football season ended, it was like, okay, what do I do now? I'm just used to being on the road and going to arenas and all that kind of stuff. And I really missed that. So every year I miss college basketball a little bit more. And I still followed, obviously, Indiana won because my fiance is an Indiana grad, so we still had all the games on. I'm still watching it and thinking, okay, what would I write about this? What would I think about this? And followed everything that was going on with the train. And I missed you guys, So, when the opportunity came, and certainly when Hugh, especially when I saw that he was going to be at Athletic, and knowing that it was a guy that I've worked with before that I really trust, who does a really good job of coming up with ideas and pushing me in the right direction, especially when I'm not being creative. Hugh does a really good job of saying, hey, here's an idea. Why don't you pursue this one? He does a really good job of saying, all right, especially when I'm just kind of running against a wall and don't feel like I'm going anywhere, he can point me in a direction and say, hey, go do this. And it always worked when I was in Bloomington, and it works even better now. So, all of those things made us, just an awesome idea. And especially when I realized that I wasn't going to be able to be a full-time sports writer in Pittsburgh anywhere. And if I had to be in the business again, I had to move. Seeing this opportunity was the obvious best case, for me to go. With people I know, a beat I know, and just getting back into this I was really excited about that. And the Athletic has been really cool. It's definitely different. Definitely not used to not writing all the time. Certainly on working for HT and all of us on the beat. It's like you want to write every single little thing that happens. You're covering every tiny little detail, and you want to publish it. And at the Athletic, we don't do that. That's not how it works. That's not what they want you to do. They want you to look at big stories, look at things in depth. And basically, if you can't do something that's really in depth and different than everybody else is doing, they don't want you to write it. And so that takes some getting used to, but it also gives you a lot of freedom. Also, gives you a lot of opportunity to swing big and go after stories and take your time and make sure that they're told as well as you'd want them to be told. So it's been a cool experience. It's been cool to cover 3 teams at once, even though it's exhausting and even though it's killing my car. It's been cool to, see how Purdue works, see how Butler works, get a better idea of those fan bases, those teams, and, have more stories to tell. All of that has been cool, and be able to say, okay, be able to compare teams to each other, look at how each of them does things, what they do that's the same, what they do is different. All that stuff's been really cool. So it's really been a good opportunity. It's really been cool to, like, again, if having to leave Pittsburgh is not something I wanted to do, but since I had to do it to get back into the business, I couldn't imagine a better place to be and a better company to work for.
You just published a really good profile on Bruiser Flint, which I encourage everybody to read. If I recall correctly, you've also written one. You wrote one on Al Durham, I think another one on Romeo earlier this year. Of all of the profiles, kind of the feature stories that you've had the opportunity to do, what has been maybe the most interesting or surprising thing that you've learned through your reporting of those stories?
Surprising thing. I don't know. I don't know that I've been shocked by anything that, not shocked or even, stunned a lot by anything that I've heard. Bruiser was fun to write because I knew him before. I covered James Madison for 5 years, so they played Drexel, so I got to see him a lot there, and it gave me a little bit more insight into what went wrong there. He really had it rolling. They were at least a steady, sort of top 4 team in that league for a while, and they were always going to be steady just because they defended so well. And I was wondering what on God's green earth went wrong, and so be able to kind of catch up with him and find out that, but also figure out how he works in an Indiana setting. He's just such a Philly guy. And I hope that came through, but it was even really true then. I just remember going to press conferences, we'd get, mostly done with it, and then he'd just want to start talking about the Eagles or the Sixers or whatever the most interesting thing going on in Philly was. There was usually somebody, especially if it was at Drexel, somebody would want to talk some other sport with him, and they would just veer off for a while because he just really cared about all that stuff. It's even some stereotypical stuff. He'd babble about cheesesteaks or something like that, just the most Philly things that you can imagine. And so he's so out of context here, so I really wanted to talk to him about that. But what was interesting to me was that then, again, just sort of connecting him to this Indiana team and how he fits. And, Ed Schilling is a guy that had worked with him at UMass. And then we obviously got to see a whole lot during, Yogi's time at Park Tudor, because that's where Schilling was coaching. So we all got to know him. So connect those two out from Schilling, what Flint was like in practice was interesting. And then finding out that, Bruiser is a big reason why Justin Smith has gotten to be a much better defender. And that sort of makes a lot of sense because Smith is the sort of personality that that Bruiser would get into. They would say, like, okay, like, you're not tough enough. You need to be tougher and just, getting into him maybe in ways that other people haven't, and then demanding more of him than maybe he even realized that he had in him. I mean, I'm sure like Dustin Smith has probably walked out of practice some days being like, what is up with that guy? Like, and like connecting the dots from what I saw him do with Drexel and how I saw him build those, just really hard-nosed defensive teams, and then sort of taking that and applying to, where Indiana's gotten better, specifically where Justin Smith has gotten better, is sort of interesting in terms of connecting different parts, of my career, of guys that I've covered, and sort of seeing, worlds collide a little bit. I mean, that's a big part of what made that story fun to write.
All right, so last question for you. Let's close kind of looking ahead to Saturday. I feel like there's lots of different narratives in play. Listless Hoosiers, continue poor play, drubbed by 30 at Mackey Arena, or, Hoosiers back against the wall, come out on fire against Purdue as Edwards goes cold. I can, as I sit here kind of looking at what goes, every 5 minutes I change what I think might happen. So I don't know if you feel comfortable giving a prediction, so do that if you want or not. But what do you think is the most likely way that game kind of goes?
The thing about it is it really just comes down to how good is Carson Edwards that day. And that's so much of Purdue. I think they're better now. They're less, I don't want to say less dependent on him, because they're still always going to be dependent on him. They can get buckets different ways with Trevion Williams. He's definitely changed the dynamic there a lot, as I said before. But if Carson plays well, it's really hard to beat them. And I don't see an obvious matchup for, who guards him? If you have a completely healthy McRoberts, I think you do the same thing with him as Michigan State did with Matt McQuaid. McQuaid did just a terrific job, and Aaron Henry, both those guys were just all over him, and they did a really good job of doubling basically every time he tried to drive the basketball, and made it really difficult. Where I think Indiana is a really good defensive team, I don't know that there is an obvious guy who fits that matchup. And I think there's he can blow by a lot of guys. He's just, obviously he can shoot it from forever. But you'll live with that. The issue when you're getting beat is when he's able to just take you off the dribble, and he's just so fast with the basketball. And I don't know right now who keeps him in front of him. I'm be very interested to see what Indiana tries to do, to make life difficult for him. I think, again, they're a good defensive team collectively, but you have to have a really good individual defensive performance. And I don't know that there's one, I guess you can put Smith on him, because you don't have to really put a great defender on either one of their power forwards. I think Wheeler is going to be a good player, but you can live with somebody else on him, and Grady Eifert's not scoring the ball a lot, so you can move your 4 guy up to a 2 guard. That's not crazy. But I don't know how that matchup works. Maybe he wins that one. But then you've got to move guys around. You have Rob Finney on No Gel Eastern, because No Gel's just going to post him up. No Gel's 6'6", and he's doesn't score a ton of points, but he knows how to take advantage when somebody, gets up in him. I guess you can, do you think about putting Romeo on him? Romeo's been okay as a defender. He hasn't been great. I think he could easily get beat up in a matchup against Edwards. So, I don't think there's anything obvious. So, right now, and a lot of it's just recency bias, because they've obviously just crushed Rutgers the other night and then had a really good performance against Wisconsin on Friday. So they just look better right now. I again, really do think you're going to see a better Indiana team Saturday than you saw Monday. Right now, I've had to guess, I'd say Purdue by a couple, but that could easily change, because I also, I think Purdue has a better answer for Langford than Indiana has for Edwards. That's my first thought. But, I don't know that. I do think also that Langford can find a way of going off as well. So, that might end up canceling out. But it's hard to say. Obviously, though, Purdue shoots it better. And, Purdue has a Ryan Klein and Indiana does not. In terms of a guy that can just either, hit set shots or hit threes off the dribble. Purdue's certainly capable of getting a lot hotter when it comes to three.
Yeah. Well said. Dustin Dopirak back with us on Podcast on the Brink. Read his work at The Athletic. Dustin, thanks for taking the time to talk with us today.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me. Thanks, guys.
For sure. Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com, and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.